The year was 1906. The rise of the automobile was a mixed blessing, an invitation to a new kind of freedom that often came packaged with a brutal isolation. The Groves was a name on a faded map, a ghost of a town that had barely survived the railroad's bypass and now lay sprawled like sun-bleached bone along a dusty, seldom-used state road in the American West. Elias Thorne, a man whose face held the perpetual tension of a spring about to snap, squinted through the windshield of his newly acquired Model K Ford. He wasn't a traveler by choice, but a salesman of specialized drilling equipment, forced by a company edict and a slim wallet to cover the territories deemed too remote for anyone else. The air was thick with the grit of pulverized earth, and the late afternoon sun beat down with the oppressive, silent fury of the desert. He'd been driving for 9 hours, and the promised civilization felt like a cruel joke. He spotted it suddenly, not a town, but a solitary, ramshackle structure that seemed to cling to the earth out of sheer stubbornness. It was a filling station, an anachronism for its time, with a single antiquated hand pump under a corrugated tin awning. Beside it was a small, 2-story dwelling that served as a store and residence. A faded sign, barely legible, read, "The Groves Stop, Gas and Lodging." Elias pulled the Model K up, the sound of the engine dying an unceremonious death in the profound silence. As the dust settled, the air didn't feel quieter. It felt heavier. The place exuded an unsettling stillness, as if the very light had been drained of its warmth. The door to the dwelling opened, and a woman emerged. Martha, as Elias would later learn, was a figure of stark contrasts. Her calico dress was clean but worn, her hands rough and stained with grease, and her face a roadmap of hard living. But it was her eyes that held Elias's attention. They were a pale, unsettling blue, constantly shifting, and devoid of any discernible warmth. She didn't smile. She simply observed. "Need gas, mister?" Her voice was a dry rasp, matching the atmosphere. "And a bed for the night, if you've got one," Elias replied, trying to inject a salesman's cheerful confidence into the strained interaction. Martha nodded slowly, her gaze sweeping over his expensive car and the luggage strapped to the back. "Got a room upstairs. 20 cents for the gas, 50 for the cot. You can settle up inside." As Elias began to crank the pump, a large, hulking man emerged from the shadows of the store's side entrance. This was Silas, Martha's husband. Silas was pure muscle and menace, his silence more intimidating than any shout. He carried a heavy, oil-stained wrench, and his eyes, dark and flat like river stones, studied Elias with an unnerving proprietary interest. "Martha, you get his things," Silas grunted, his voice a low vibration in his chest. "I'll finish with the fuel." Elias hesitated, a flicker of unease crossing his mind. "I'm fine, I can manage the pump, thanks." Silas didn't move. He simply tilted his head, a gesture of absolute authority. "Out here, we help each other. It's the way." The phrase sounded less like courtesy and more like an order. Elias, sensing the danger of a confrontation in this remote place, reluctantly stepped back. As he did, he noticed something odd near the pump, a patch of earth that looked freshly turned, darker than the surrounding parched ground. He dismissed it as a garden plot, but the thought lingered, an irritant he couldn't quite scratch. Inside the store, the air was close, heavy with the scent of stale oil, old tobacco, and something faintly, but distinctly, metallic. The shelves were sparsely stocked with dusty, out-of-date goods. As Martha led him up a creaking staircase to a cramped room, Elias noticed a closed, heavy wooden door tucked away in the back corner of the store, secured with a large, rusted padlock. It felt like a point of extreme tension in the small building. The room upstairs was tiny and sparsely furnished, a narrow cot, a basin, and a single cracked window that offered no view but the endless, desolate horizon. "Dinner is at 7, Martha said, her voice clipped. "We only serve what we have. Don't wonder." The final sentence, devoid of inflection, carried a quiet threat. Left alone, Elias sat on the cot. His rational mind told him it was the isolation, the heat, and his exhaustion making him paranoid. This was just a desperate, struggling family in a forgotten corner of the country. Yet a chill that had nothing to do with the outside temperature began to creep over him. He walked to the window. Below, Silas was no longer by the pump. He was crouched by the fresh earth, using the heavy wrench not for repairs, but to tamp down the dirt. He paused, looked up directly at the window, and gave Elias a look that wasn't hostile, wasn't friendly, but was chillingly knowing. Elias quickly retreated from the window. He was a long way from help, and the feeling in his gut was no longer simple fatigue. It was the cold, unmistakable premonition of being prey. He realized his presence, his car, and his wallet had changed the dynamic of this silent, dusty place. He was not a customer. He was an arrival that had been expected for a long, long time. He felt the need to inspect the area, to understand the chilling atmosphere of the place. He was a salesman, a problem solver, but now he was solving for his own survival. He needed to find out what was behind that locked door and what Silas was truly burying in the earth outside. The mystery was already suffocating him. Did Elias make the right choice stopping here? The Groves has a history of swallowing travelers whole. If you want to see how Elias tries to outsmart this chilling family and uncover the terrifying truth of their operation, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. New chapters of this macabre story drop soon. Elias spent the next hour in a spiral of strained silence, the silence amplified by the rhythmic, deliberate sound of Silas chopping wood outside. It was a monotonous, powerful sound that felt like a countdown. He couldn't shake the image of Silas's eyes, the knowing gaze that felt like a predator marking its territory. He rummaged through his suitcase, not for comfort, but for defense. The drilling equipment samples were useless. He found a stout, 9-inch steel file, intended for sharpening tools, and slipped it into his trouser pocket. It was a meager weapon, but in the oppressive darkness beginning to settle over the Groves, it was all he had. The summons for dinner came not as a call, but as a heavy stomping on the stairs. It was a young man, perhaps 19, with the same unsettling vacant look as his mother, Martha, but lacking Silas's brute certainty. This was Caleb, the family's son. He didn't speak, just pointed downstairs with a thumb. The dinner was served in the main room of the store, at a rough-hewn table by the back door, the one with the enormous rusted padlock. The meal was a thick, unappetizing stew, heavy with root vegetables and some kind of tough, stringy meat. Elias forced himself to eat, his senses on high alert. The atmosphere at the table was suffocating. Martha sat opposite him, watching every movement of his fork. Silas sat at the head, radiating quiet menace, his massive hands resting on the table beside his plate. Caleb stood against the wall, observing with unsettling detachment. Elias attempted to break the tension with a salesman's practiced charm. "It's a long way out here. You must see all kinds of travelers passing through." Silas chewed slowly, deliberately. "Some pass, some stay." "Stay?" Elias asked, trying to sound casual, though a tremor ran through him. "Stay a while." Martha cut in, her voice flat. "Help with the chores. Rest their weary bones." Her pale eyes flickered to the fresh patch of dirt Elias had seen outside. Elias swallowed a dry piece of stew. "I appreciate the offer, but I'm on a tight schedule. New Mexico territory awaits." "New Mexico is far," Silas rumbled, finally speaking. "Cars break, people get lost." The subtle shift in their language was the real terror. The threat was not explicit, but implied in the context of their isolation and their unnatural calmness. The mystery centered on what they were doing to those who stayed. Elias looked towards the locked back door. "What's back there? Storage?" Martha and Silas exchanged a glance that was swift, cold, and entirely shared. "Private," Silas stated, finality in his tone. Not for guests. Elias realized he had pushed too far. He finished his meal quickly, excusing himself with a feigned yawn, claiming exhaustion. He knew he couldn't sleep. The stew settled in his stomach like a cold knot of fear. Back upstairs, Elias began a meticulous examination of the room. The floorboards were old and creaked, but one near the window seemed slightly looser than the others. Using the steel file, he worked it loose. Beneath it, there was only dry dust and the smell of old wood. It was a dead end, but the exercise calmed his mind. He crept to the door and listened. The low, guttural murmur of Silas and Martha's voices drifted up the stairwell, too muffled to make out words, but the tone was conspiratorial, predatory. He heard the faint, heavy sound of the padlock on the back door being unlatched, followed by the muffled drag of something heavy, something that scraped roughly against the stone floor below. The scent of that metallic, almost coppery odor he had noticed earlier intensified, briefly wafting up the stairs before the door was quickly and firmly shut again. Elias knew then, with chilling certainty, that this was not a place of hospitality. The metallic smell, the secrecy, the freshly turned earth, the heavy lock, it all pointed to one terrible, inescapable conclusion about the fate of the travelers who stayed. He had to get out, but the Model K was parked right beside the pump, exposed. He couldn't risk starting the engine. The sound would instantly alert the family. His only chance was to wait until the house fell silent, slip downstairs, and find a way to get to his car or, failing that, to use the distraction of his escape to uncover the secret of the locked room. The thought of confronting Silas, the human embodiment of sheer physical power, made his hands sweat. But the thought of becoming another secret buried in the dirt of the groves was a far greater terror. The real challenge was not escape, but discovery. The gnawing need to know the true nature of their operation before he risked everything. He pressed his ear against the floorboard, listening to the secrets the old house held captive. The moon, a thin sliver of silver, offered little light through the grime-streaked window. Elias lay on the cot, fully dressed, the steel file clutched in his hand. He waited, his muscles coiled tight, for the house to surrender to sleep. The sounds finally faded to a deep, heavy silence, broken only by the sporadic creaking of the old structure settling. At what he judged to be past midnight, Elias eased open his door. The stairs were treacherous, each step a potential alarm bell. He moved with agonizing slowness, his weight shifted toward the banister, finding the quieter spots. He reached the main room. The darkness was profound, the shapes of the meager furniture looming like silent sentinels. The most dominant feature was the back door, the black silhouette of the large padlock now visible, locked again. Elias crept toward the counter. He needed a distraction, something that would allow him to examine the lock or the back room if the family was alerted. He found a box of old, greasy rags and a half-full can of kerosene intended for the lamps. As he reached the back door, a sudden sharp cough echoed from the hallway leading to the bedrooms. Elias froze, heart pounding against his ribs, flattened against the wall beside the door. It was Martha. He heard her footsteps, slow, dragging, moving toward the kitchen area. He waited, holding his breath, until the sound of running water indicated she was occupied. He seized the opportunity to quickly examine the lock. It was a massive, old-fashioned brass padlock, its keyhole small and recessed. The steel file was useless for picking it, too thick and blunt. He needed the key. He backed away, retreating toward the stairs. His plan to investigate was thwarted, but he learned two critical things. The lock was industrial strength, and the family was a lighter sleep than he'd hoped. The next morning, the tension was palpable. Elias descended the stairs and found Silas already by the pump, tinkering with a rusty piece of equipment. "Morning," Elias said, forcing a cheerful tone. "I should be on my way. I'll pay for the lodging now." Silas wiped his hands on an oily rag, his gaze hard. The car. It's got a problem. Elias felt a cold wave wash over him. What kind of problem? It was running fine yesterday. Loose connection, Silas said, nodding toward the engine. Or maybe the timing. Took a look while you were sleeping. It won't start now. This was the trap. Elias knew instinctively that the car had been deliberately sabotaged. Silas hadn't been tinkering. He had rendered the vehicle immobile. Elias was now fully stranded, a victim of mechanical failure, a perfectly realistic and untraceable method of entrapment in 1906. Well, that's just my luck, Elias sighed, trying to project irritation rather than outright panic. Can you fix it? Might take a day or two, Silas said, the corner of his mouth barely twitching. Got to get parts from the nearest town. That's 100 miles away. I'll pay you extra, Elias offered, calculating his next move. Silas waved a hand dismissively. We help those who need it. That's the way out here. But you'll need to stay another night, maybe two, and you'll need to earn your keep. Can't have you loafing. The proposition felt less like hospitality and more like integration into a hostile system. Elias knew he had to accept. Any resistance would immediately confirm his suspicion and mark him as dangerous. Fine. What do you need me to do? Help me move some heavy crates in the back, Silas said, pointing toward the heavy locked door. In the cellar. Elias's heart leaped. The chance for discovery had arrived, disguised as forced labor. Silas took a heavy ring of keys from his belt, and the largest key, the one for the padlock, glinted menacingly in the morning sun. He unlocked the door with a loud, grating clack. The door swung inward, revealing a flight of stone steps leading down into a dark, damp basement. The air that rushed out was cold, thick, and the metallic scent was overwhelming, the smell of old blood, oil, and decay. Caleb is down there already, Silas said. Go down. Martha and I will bring the ropes. Elias descended the stairs. The suspense was almost unbearable. He was walking straight into the heart of the mystery, into the cellar that held the terrifying secrets of the Grove's stop. He knew that his survival now depended on his ability to observe, to play the role of the docile, stranded traveler, and to find the single, crucial piece of evidence that would explain the horror the family was enacting. He had crossed the line from being an observer to becoming an active participant in their grim routine. The stone steps were slick with an unseen moisture, and the air in the cellar was cold and heavy, a stark contrast to the heat above ground. The overwhelming metallic odor was now sickeningly apparent, mingled with the earthy smell of damp concrete and something acrid, like lye or bleach. At the bottom, the space opened into a cavernous, low-ceilinged grotto, illuminated by a single bare electric bulb that cast harsh shadows. Caleb was there, standing awkwardly beside several wooden crates stacked against a far wall. We need to move these to the loading area, Caleb mumbled, his gaze fixed on the dirt floor. The cellar was disturbingly utilitarian. There were tools, shovels, picks, and various heavy-duty processing equipment that Elias, the equipment salesman, recognized as modified industrial machines. They were not for drilling, they were designed for pulverizing and rendering. As he moved a crate, Elias strategically bumped into a stack of old burlap sacks. They weren't filled with grain or coal, they were heavy, dense, and had a strange, irregular shape. He noticed a dark, dried stain seeping through the coarse fabric of one sack. "Be careful," Caleb snapped, an uncharacteristic sharpness in his voice. "Don't mess with the inventory." "Sorry," Elias said, steadying the crate. "Just clumsy." His eyes darted around the room. In a corner, partially hidden under a tarp, was a collection of personal effects. A leather-bound travel bag, a woman's lace-up boot, and a man's pocket watch, its chain broken. These were not the possessions of a local, they were the remnants of travelers. Then he saw the most damning piece of evidence. On a heavy workbench there was a large, shallow metal trough. It was scoured clean, but streaks of a dark, viscous substance remained in the crevices, and beside it lay a small, rusty bone fragment, unnervingly white against the grime of the metal. The rendering equipment, the bone, the personal items, and the metallic smell. Elias's mind snapped the pieces together. The family wasn't just killing their victims, they were processing them, eradicating all trace. Silas and Martha descended the stairs, carrying thick hemp ropes and a block and tackle. "Take this side," Silas ordered Elias, handing him the rope. "We use the lift here." The lift was a rough, hand-cranked hoist attached to a steel beam in the ceiling, used to lift heavy objects to a delivery hatch leading outside. As they strained to move the heavy crates, Silas was breathing hard, his face a mask of exertion. Elias, pretending to strain, used the opportunity to observe their method. The whole operation was executed with a grim, practiced efficiency. "What's in these, Silas?" Elias asked, trying to sound genuinely curious. Silas grunted. "Parts, metal castings, heavy stuff. Gotta move the raw materials out of the way before the next shipment." Elias realized the crates were likely filled with rendered material, disguised as heavy industrial parts, perhaps even being sold to scrap yards or rendering plants far away. The gas station was a front for a gruesome, self-sustaining operation, exploiting the anonymity of isolated roads and the vulnerability of early automobile travelers. As the last crate was secured, Silas wiped his brow. "Good work, Elias. You've got some muscle." Elias managed a shaky smile. "Glad to help." As they climbed the stairs, Elias had a sudden, desperate idea. The one thing that truly tied the family to their victims was the victims' cars. The Model K was outside. Evidence. If he could disable it permanently, make it look like a devastating, unfixable breakdown, the family might be forced to abandon the vehicle quickly, perhaps burying it. He could then reveal the truth to the authorities, using the car's disappearance as proof. He was no longer just trying to escape, he was collecting evidence to ensure justice, or at least to stop the macabre end of the next traveler. That night, Elias couldn't eat the meager supper. The smell of the stew, coupled with the horrors he'd witnessed, made his stomach revolt. He claimed a headache and returned to his room. He waited until the house was dark. His plan was risky. He needed to get to his Model K, not to start it, but to destroy a critical, non-replaceable part of its engine, something that would necessitate a complete engine change, a costly, time-consuming effort in 1906. He reached for his steel file. He was going to use his salesman's knowledge against the predatory family, turning their own trap against them. The night air was dry and cool, a momentary relief from the cellar's damp chill. Elias crept out of the house, moving around the building's perimeter like a phantom. The Model K sat under the weak awning, a beacon of expensive evidence. He lifted the heavy hood. His heart pounded a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He knew exactly what to target: the magneto coil. It was a delicate, crucial component of the ignition system. A salesman of technical equipment knew how to break the things he sold. Using the steel file, he carefully but forcefully struck the coil's housing several times, cracking the fragile ceramic insulator inside. The damage was subtle but definitive. The car was now truly dead, a mechanical corpse. He wiped the file clean and returned to his room, his whole body shaking with a mix of adrenaline and terror. He had sealed his fate as a long-term guest, a necessary sacrifice to gain time and gather more concrete proof. The next morning, Elias approached Silas. "Silas, I took a look at the Model K last night. I know a bit about engines. It's not just a loose connection. I think the magneto is shot. Cracked coil." Silas stared at him, his expression unchanging, a wall of suspicion. "You're a salesman, not a mechanic, Elias." "But I know the parts I sell," Elias countered, maintaining a steady gaze. "That car isn't going anywhere without a new magneto. That means a 3-day round trip for parts, minimum. I'm stuck, Silas. Guess I'm helping out longer." Silas remained silent, assessing the truth in Elias's voice. The fact that Elias, the victim, had accepted his fate and even diagnosed the problem seemed to placate the brute's suspicion. Elias had handed Silas a new, solid justification for keeping him around. "All right," Silas finally agreed, a rough grin crossing his face. "Then you earn your keep. There's a delivery coming today. Fertilizer. You'll haul it to the barn." The day passed in a blur of exhausting, pointless labor, designed, Elias suspected, to keep him too weary to think clearly. The fertilizer was in thick, heavy bags, too heavy for what was purported to be inside. As he moved them into the dimly lit barn, he noticed a disturbing pattern. The bags were arranged to cover patches of the rough wooden floor, areas where the planks looked newly replaced. The barn, separate from the main building, was an annex of the operation. It housed not only tools and supplies, but also a deep, dark trench along one wall, partially covered with loose hay, likely a pit for quick disposal or initial processing. While moving the final bag, Elias deliberately dropped a small metal bracket he had secreted from his toolbox. It landed with a soft thud and rolled under a pile of old canvases. "Lost a part," Elias muttered, crawling under the canvases. He didn't look for the bracket. His eyes were drawn to a small, crudely drawn map scratched into the dirt floor beneath the hay. It wasn't a treasure map, but a diagram, a rough sketch of the property, detailing the location of the filling station, the store, the barn, and 3 distinct circled X's near the edge of the property, marked with faded, almost invisible symbols, a boot, a watch, and a hat. The X's corresponded to burial sites. The family had a system, a cruel record of their crimes. Elias was looking at the key to everything. He quickly copied the layout onto the back of a business card with a tiny pencil stub, memorizing the symbols and their corresponding locations before replacing the hay. As he emerged, dusted with straw, Caleb was watching him from the barn door, his pale eyes narrowed. "What were you doing under there?" "Just looking for that bracket." "Found it," Elias lied, holding up the tiny piece of metal. Caleb nodded slowly, but the suspicion did not entirely leave his face. "The boss says dinner in 10 minutes. Don't be late." Elias knew the danger had just escalated. Caleb was the loose cannon, the one who reacted to uncertainty with aggression. Elias had now confirmed the existence of multiple victims and their burial spots. The mystery of the family's operation was solved. The only remaining suspense was how he would use this devastating truth to survive and expose them. He needed an ally, or at least a distraction. He needed another variable in this closed system. He realized he had to leave a trail, a desperate message to the outside world, a contingency for failure. The question was, how? The next day brought a new variable, the distraction Elias desperately needed. Mid-morning, the silence was shattered by the unmistakable sound of a sputtering, struggling engine. A second car, a heavier, older touring vehicle, pulled up to the Grove's stop. Out stepped Mrs. Eleanor Vance, a woman in her late 40s, impeccably dressed despite the dust, with a determined chin and a formidable air. She was an independent woman of means, clearly unaccustomed to the hardships of isolated travel, and she had a problem. "Good heavens," she announced, adjusting her hat. "Are you the proprietor? My engine is overheating dreadfully. I've been stranded for hours. I require water and immediate assistance." Silas emerged, his face a mask of false hospitality, quickly sizing up his new victim. A woman traveling alone, likely wealthy and clearly distressed. "Of course, ma'am," Silas drawled, his voice a sickeningly smooth impersonation of a helpful serviceman. "We'll take care of your engine. Seems like you'll have to stay the night with us." Eleanor sighed dramatically. "A night in this dust bowl? Very well. Just fix the car by dawn. I have a train connection to catch." Elias, who had been chopping kindling by the house, saw his opportunity. He was no longer the sole target. The family's attention was now divided. More importantly, he had a witness, a credible, well-connected person who could be his lifeline. He was introduced to Eleanor as Elias, the stranded mechanic, a fabrication that solidified his cover. During dinner, which was slightly more elaborate than usual for the benefit of the new guest, Elias attempted to communicate the peril. Martha and Silas were hyper-vigilant, but Eleanor, distracted by her own discomfort, provided a perfect cover. "It's an awful shame about my car," Eleanor lamented, dabbing her mouth with a handkerchief. "And Mr. Thorne here tells me his car is entirely useless. What dreadful luck for both of us." "It is," Elias agreed, looking directly at Eleanor. "But I think our luck is man-made, ma'am, not bad weather." He emphasized the words, trying to convey a secret message. Eleanor merely raised a skeptical eyebrow, assuming he was speaking of shoddy manufacturing. Later, as Martha showed Eleanor to the guest room, the one right next to Elias's, Elias positioned himself in the hall. "Mrs. Vance?" he whispered urgently as Martha descended the stairs. "I need to speak to you." Quietly. "I fear we are both in grave danger." Eleanor, though startled, maintained her composure. "Danger, Mr. Thorne? From this dusty little family?" "They are not a family of service," Elias hissed. "They are predators. They sabotage the cars. The people who stop here disappear. I have seen evidence. The cellar, the barn. It's an operation of murder and disposal." Eleanor stared at him, her eyes wide with shock, but also a flicker of genuine terror. You can't be serious. That's a monstrous accusation." "Look at their eyes," Elias pressed. "Look at the lock on the back door. Feel the air in this place. I need your help." "I need a diversion. You are their distraction. I need to get to their tools, the ones they use for the car. I believe the key to their operation is also the key to our escape." Eleanor, faced with the overwhelming reality of her situation, paused. She was a woman of logic, but the sheer isolation and Elias's desperate conviction began to erode her doubt. "What exactly do you need me to do, Mr. Thorne?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Tomorrow morning you must demand a meeting with Silas, publicly. Demand to see the parts he's ordered, accuse him of deliberate delay," Elias explained rapidly. "The bolder you are, the better the diversion. I will use the time to search their living quarters for the cellar key. It's the only way to get the evidence I need to stop them forever." Eleanor nodded, her face hardening with a steel resolve. The fear was still there, but her formidable nature had reasserted itself. She was not the type to go quietly. "I will give you 10 minutes, Eleanor said, a newfound focus in her voice. "But you must promise me we escape together, and we go to the nearest sheriff." "I promise," Elias said, a surge of desperate hope flooding him. The presence of Eleanor had created a critical shift in the power dynamic. Elias now had an accomplice, and the family's confidence was their weakness. Elias prepared for the morning, knowing that the confrontation Eleanor would incite could lead to their salvation, or their macabre end. Dawn broke with an oppressive heat, foreshadowing a day of high tension. Eleanor, true to her word, was dressed in her finest motoring attire, radiating an air of imperious impatience. At the breakfast table, a silent, strained affair, Eleanor began her performance. "Silas," she announced, setting down her fork with a decisive clink, "this delay is unacceptable. I intend to leave by mid-morning. I require proof of the part you've supposedly ordered." Silas looked up, his face darkening with annoyance. "Ma'am, these things take time. The delivery is by wagon. You can't rush the mules." "I am not concerned with your mules," Eleanor retorted, her voice rising slightly. "I am concerned with your lack of professionalism. I want to see your order ledger, your invoice, or I will write a letter to the State Attorney General regarding your extortionate practices." The sheer audacity of the accusation worked like a charm. Silas, accustomed to the timid compliance of stranded travelers, was genuinely taken aback. "You can't just Silas began, rising halfway from his chair. "I can," Eleanor interrupted, standing fully. "I want to see your office, now. I suspect you are simply lying about the parts. I will not be detained by incompetence." Silas, wary of the threat of official intervention and knowing the consequences of the law finding their operation, hesitated. Martha, sensing the shift in control, shot Elias a glance. A fleeting moment of pure, raw suspicion. "Fine," Silas growled, signaling Martha to watch Elias. "Martha, keep an eye on our guest. Caleb, with me. Show this woman the books." As the three of them moved to a small, dusty back room near the kitchen, Elias knew his window was small and closing fast. Martha stood by the main counter, her back to him, pretending to wipe down the already clean surface. Elias moved quickly and silently into the living area, directly behind the store. He was looking for a hiding spot, a place where a heavy, frequently used object like the cellar key would be kept. He ignored the dressers and cabinets, focusing instead on the practical reality of the family's habits. His eyes fell upon a heavy cast-iron oil lamp on a side table. It was the only object of any real weight in the small space. He lifted it. Underneath, a shallow indentation had been carved into the wood. In the indentation lay a piece of folded leather. Elias unrolled the leather. Inside was a single, heavy, blackened brass key, the cellar key. He heard Eleanor's voice from the office. "Nonsense, Silas. This date is 6 weeks old. You have ordered nothing." The distraction was perfect. Elias didn't descend the stairs immediately. He knew the cellar was likely empty of recent victims, but the key allowed him access to the evidence he needed to solidify his case. He needed irrefutable proof to present to a skeptical sheriff. He hurried back to his room. He took the brass key and attached a length of thin, strong twine he carried for securing his equipment samples. He needed to get the key to Eleanor for safekeeping and to use it for his final act of discovery later. He knocked lightly on the wall shared with Eleanor's room. 3 taps. Eleanor opened her door a crack. Her face was pale, but her eyes were burning with fear and determination. "I have it," Elias whispered, handing her the key, still attached to the twine. "Hide it. Don't let them find it. Tonight I will use the twine to retrieve it, and I will go back down." "Elias, don't go back down there," Eleanor pleaded. "Let's just take the key and run. That is our proof. They will simply claim we stole a key and vandalized their property. The local sheriff will believe them, not us, 2 stranded travelers. I need what is down there. I need the names," Elias insisted. "I need proof of who they killed, not just that they killed. It's the only way to shut down this operation permanently." Eleanor, defeated, nodded. "Be careful, they're coming out." She closed the door just as Silas and Caleb re-emerged, their faces livid. Silas stomped over to Elias, who was pretending to be fixing a belt buckle. "You put her up to this, didn't you, Thorne? Telling her lies." "Me?" "No, sir," Elias said, feigning confusion. "She's a tough bird, that one. Clearly not happy about the car situation." Silas glared, his giant hand twitching by his side. The suspense had reached a fever pitch. Elias had the key's location and an ally, but he had pushed Silas to the very edge. Tonight, the risk would be fatal. The psychological pressure is immense. Elias has taken the ultimate risk by securing the key. If you want to see if Elias can gather the final, irrefutable evidence and escape this terrifying place, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. You won't want to miss the final chapters of this macabre mystery. The plan for the night was simple, audacious, and terrifying. Elias waited for the familiar silence to fall over the groves. Once he was certain the family was asleep, he unwound the spool of twine he'd given Eleanor. He worked a small hook, fashioned from the steel file, and a piece of bent wire through his own keyhole, reaching for Eleanor's room. He gave the twine a gentle tug. Eleanor, ready, tied the key securely to the other end and paid out the slack. Elias secured the heavy brass key. It felt cold and authoritative in his hand. He crept down the stairs, the sound of his heart now louder than the floorboards. He reached the locked door, inserted the key, and with a terrible grating sound turned the lock. He opened the door just enough to slip through, then closed it, leaving the key in the lock. The cellar was even colder and darker than before. Elias lit a small, homemade tallow candle he had constructed from kitchen scraps, its weak light casting dancing shadows across the grim space. He moved quickly, following the logic that had guided him before. The family had a system. They were organized criminals. He needed their records. He moved toward the workbench, the site of the most heinous activity. He noticed a small wooden box tucked into a niche beneath the bench, disguised by a pile of oil rags. He pulled it out. It was locked. Elias used the file again. A tool of his trade now turned into a tool for justice. With a practiced twist and pressure, he forced the simple lock. It sprang open with a soft click. Inside there was no money, no jewels, just a collection of small, leather-bound notebooks. These were the ledgers of the damned. He opened the first one, dated 3 years prior. The entries were meticulously kept. Each page contained a date, a short description of the victim's vehicle, and a terse, almost accounting-like notation. M. Vance, 1904 Rambler, proceeds, 175, cash, watch, location, X hat. The entries were a chilling catalogue of their murders. They detailed the names of the victims, mostly traveling salesmen, single women or couples passing through, the property they'd stolen, the value they'd gained, and a reference to the map symbols Elias had seen in the barn. Elias quickly flipped through the pages. The final entry, written in crude, almost celebratory script, was dated yesterday. Elias Thorne, Model K, heavy luggage, drilling gear, to be processed. His name was listed, a chilling premonition of his impending fate. He also found a few pages dedicated to the family's methods, a manifesto of depravity. It explained their meticulous, non-supernatural methodology. The use of carbon monoxide pumped into the lodging room vents, a small, cleverly concealed pipe he now realized he should have looked for. The quick disposal and rendering for materials, fat, bone and scrap metal, to sustain their isolated life and fund the purchase of supplies. They were not killing for passion, but for survival and profit, a realistic, terrifying form of entrepreneurial murder. Elias tore out the pages containing the last 10 entries, including his own. He tucked them into his shirt pocket. He had the irrefutable evidence. As he was about to blow out the candle, he heard it. A low, rhythmic thumping sound coming from the corner of the cellar near a pile of old timbers. It was too regular to be an animal. It sounded like knocking. Elias moved slowly, the tallow light casting grotesque shadows. He pushed the timbers aside. Beneath them was a sheet of heavy, reinforced metal, bolted to the stone floor. The knocking was coming from under the metal. It was a vent, an escape drain or a cistern cover, and someone, somehow, was alive beneath it. A terrible new layer of the mystery was revealed. The family kept some of their victims, or perhaps an earlier failed escapee, imprisoned. The thumping stopped. Elias heard a heavy, dragging footstep above him. Silas was awake. Elias quickly blew out the candle, plunging the cellar into absolute blackness. He fumbled for the lock. The key was in the latch. The suspense was now agonizing. He had the evidence, but the labyrinth had revealed one final, agonizing turn, a potentially living victim he couldn't save. He was trapped between saving the living proof in his pocket and confronting a human monster. He was moments from being caught, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. Elias wrenched the heavy brass key from the cellar door's lock, the sound of metal on metal grating loudly in the profound silence of the night. He scrambled up the stone steps, his injured knee protesting with every upward movement, his heart hammering a frenzied rhythm against the fragile ribs encasing it. As he reached the top landing, poised to burst back into the store, he heard the heavy, rhythmic breathing of Silas just on the other side of the thick wooden barrier. The behemoth was waiting, a dark shadow of monstrous patience. He didn't pause to strategize. Hesitation was a death sentence. He burst through the door, using the full weight of his shoulder and body momentum to ram into Silas. The impact was startling, not enough to fell the giant, but sufficient to throw him off balance. Silas let out a startled, primal roar, a sound of injured ego and sudden surprise. The force sent Silas stumbling back, his massive bulk crashing against the rough wooden counter with a loud, sickening crack that fractured the silence and echoed the splintering of wood. Elias didn't spare a glance backward. His focus was entirely on escape and the precious evidence. He ran for the main staircase, the torn pages of the ledger, the final irrefutable proof, rattling like dry bones against his frantic chest. Silas recovered instantly, his immense physical power allowing him to shrug off the blow, his rage now a palpable, terrifying presence in the suffocating darkness. "The key! Thief!" he bellowed, his voice shaking the very rafters of the old building. "He took the key! Stop him!" Elias reached the top of the stairs, not daring to slow down, and screamed, "Eleanor, run, now!" He burst into the cramped, low-ceilinged hall, just as Martha was emerging from the master bedroom, her face contorted into a mask of pure malice. In her hand, she wielded a heavy, antiquated cast-iron skillet, a domestic tool now weaponized. She swung with surprising, desperate speed. Elias instinctively threw his head back and ducked just in time. The skillet whistled inches from his ear, missing his skull by a hair's breadth, and embedded itself deep into the wooden wall with a bone-jarring, sickening thud. The force of the blow was enough to make the entire structure tremble. Eleanor Vance, roused from a fitful sleep by the eruption of chaos, emerged from her room. Fully dressed, her face was a canvas of shock and raw terror. She saw the madness in Martha's eyes, the sheer, panicked desperation in Elias's. She didn't waste a precious second questioning the reality of the nightmare. She simply sprinted toward the store's rear entrance, her mind focused only on the temporary freedom of her car. Silas, now a figure of absolute terrifying wrath and still clutching at his side, lumbered heavily to the top of the stairs. He ignored Eleanor. She was a secondary concern, easily recaptured. His singular, tunnel vision focus was entirely on Elias Thorne, the man who had seen their truth and threatened their entire existence. "You won't leave this place, Thorne. You'll stay here forever. You're ours." Silas roared, lunging forward like a maddened bull. Elias dodged the reckless, desperate attack, slipping past Silas's outstretched hand. He ran, not towards the front door, which led to a clear, open path and the exposed road, but toward the relative shelter of the small, greasy kitchen. He knew the layout. He needed a weapon, something sharp, solid, and real. A final, realistic tool for sheer survival. His frantic eyes spotted the butcher block. He seized the longest, sharpest butcher knife available, its blade gleaming with a faint, deadly luminescence in the weak moonlight filtering through the dusty window. He pivoted, turning to face Silas, who stopped short, a moment of genuine surprise crossing his monstrous features at the sight of the diminutive salesman armed and fighting back. "It's over, Silas," Elias gasped, clutching the knife tightly, the handle slick with sweat. "I know everything. I have the ledger, the names, the law will find this place. You've lost." Silas didn't reply with coherent words, but with a terrifying, purely animalistic snarl, a sound of cornered fury. He advanced slowly, deliberately, his face a mask of absolute confidence, relying entirely on his overwhelming brute size and muscle, treating the knife in Elias's hand as a minor, easily dismissed inconvenience. "You are nothing," Silas muttered, his voice a low, terrifyingly casual, guttural sound. "Just another piece of scrap. I'll break you." As Silas charged, lowering his massive shoulder for a crushing tackle, Elias didn't try to deliver a fatal frontal blow. He knew he couldn't penetrate the man's massive bulk or overcome his power. In a desperate split-second last-resort move that blended panic with surgical precision, he dropped swiftly to one knee and drove the knife blade with all his remaining strength into Silas's right Achilles tendon, the single, most vital, unprotected point of his massive frame. Silas's roar of pain was immediate, deafening, and absolute. The sound seemed to tear the fabric of the night. He stumbled, his massive weight crashing uncontrollably to the rough wooden floor, the sickening sound of splintering wood and what sounded like the dull thud of a broken bone echoing violently through the night. The element of surprise, coupled with the precision of targeting a weak, vital point, had instantaneously and effectively neutralized the main physical threat. Martha, witnessing her husband's collapse, shrieked a high, keening sound and lunged at Elias, her face twisted in a mask of pure, unbridled fury and desperation. Elias managed to shove her back, but she latched onto his arm, her grip surprisingly strong, digging her nails in deep. It was then that Caleb appeared from the inky shadows of the back hallway, unnoticed until the very last second. He was the silent, unpredictable component. A rusted tire iron, heavy and deadly, was held high above his head. He brought it down with silent, savage efficiency, a killing blow intended for Elias's skull. Elias saw the fatal swing, but the pain in his arm and the residual shock of the fight made him too slow. The iron connected with a sickening crunch against his left shoulder, not his head, but the impact sent a searing, white-hot wave of nerve pain shooting through his entire body, instantly numbing his left arm, forcing the butcher knife from his grip, and sending him sprawling helplessly across the greasy kitchen floor. Caleb stood over him, breathing heavily, the tire iron raised high for the inevitable final killing blow. Suddenly, a massive older man covered in the dust and grime of long imprisonment erupted from the previously locked cellar door. It was the imprisoned man, John, whom Elias had heard knocking, the living proof. Eleanor, witnessing the attack and realizing Caleb's distraction, had used the chaos to quickly unlock the hidden metal grate on the cellar floor, fulfilling her desperate promise to help the man escape. John, though weakened by his ordeal, was driven by a powerful primal survival instinct and a searing thirst for retribution. He didn't waste time with words or observation. He simply lunged, tackling Caleb from behind with surprising force, sending the younger man crashing violently to the floor, the murderous tire iron skittering away into the darkness with a metallic clatter. Elias scrambled instantly to his knees and then to his feet, clutching his throbbing, useless left shoulder. He saw the final, chaotic chance. He needed to secure the final piece of evidence and make his escape now. Eleanor was already outside, sprinting toward her touring car, which was now idling after a desperate, successful crank start. A car freed by Silas's momentary negligence. She stopped short, turned, and screamed across the intervening space, her voice cracking with urgency. "Elias, your car key. They keep it in the clock, the antique clock." Elias, galvanized by her warning, darted to the tall, antique clock on the mantelpiece, his fingers fumbling desperately with the small wooden access door. Inside, taped securely to the slow-moving pendulum, was his Model K car key. He had the evidence, the key, and a crucial if violent distraction. He fled the house without a backward glance, leaving behind the gruesome, visceral, no-holds-barred fight between John, the former forgotten victim, and the two remaining members of the family, Martha and Caleb. The relentless suspense had culminated in this final, violent reality. He ran for his broken Model K, knowing the engine was dead, but he had one final, desperate strategy, a sacrifice of evidence for the sake of irrefutable proof, to escape the groves and seal the Thorne family's macabre end. Elias threw himself, wincing, into the driver's seat of the disabled Model K. His left shoulder was screaming a chorus of agony, a burning protest against the violence it had endured. But the tattered, irreplaceable pages of the ledger were still pressed tightly against his chest, the final, undeniable proof that sealed the family's fate. Eleanor Vance was already successfully cranking her older, heavier touring car. The engine sputtered a desperate mechanical plea, caught, and then roared to powerful life, a welcome sound of freedom and mobility. She backed up violently, tires spitting gravel, her headlights cutting sharp, desperate paths through the final clinging gloom of the pre-dawn night. "My car is dead, Eleanor," Elias shouted over the deafening noise of her engine. "The magneto is shot. I did it myself." Eleanor drove her touring car up beside his, her face strained with fear and exhaustion, but her gaze fixed and resolute. "We leave the car. Get in now, Elias. We're running out of time." "No. They'll just bury it." And there goes the last piece of physical evidence linking the Thorne family to the disappearances, Elias yelled, refusing to abandon the crucial component of his trap. "I have the keys, but I need to make the car untraceable for them, but traceable for the police. Drive to the end of the dirt track, the one leading to the dry creek bed. Wait for me there. I'll be quick." With his adrenaline-fueled, functional right arm, Elias took the steel file, his constant companion and now tool of sabotage, and began working furiously on his own Model K. He was not a mechanic, but he was a dedicated salesman who understood the critical breakable mechanics of his product better than anyone. He quickly located the small secondary fuel line leading from the main tank. Using the file like a crude chisel, he hammered a sharp, small puncture into the brittle metal line. The precious gasoline, the very element that fueled his freedom, began to steadily and quickly seep out onto the dry ground beneath the car. He jumped out of the car, grabbing a half-full tin of machine oil from his trunk. He splashed the flammable oil liberally over the leather seats, dousing the engine components and soaking the exposed wooden frame of the Model K. He then grabbed a handful of sulfur matches he kept for lighting his drilling lamps. Inside the store, the terrible noises had subsided. Elias heard a final, muffled, despairing scream, followed by a heavy, sickening thud, the sound of a body collapsing. The gruesome fight was over. He didn't know who had prevailed, but he couldn't afford to wait a single second to find out. Elias lit a match, the tiny flame momentarily comforting in the immense darkness. With trembling hands, he tossed it onto the oil-soaked passenger seat. The fire caught immediately, a roaring, hungry inferno fueled by the volatile machine oil and the gasoline leaking from the punctured line. The Model K, a symbol of modern freedom that had become his cage and the evidence of his near death, was instantly consumed in a brilliant, terrifying blaze. The heat was immense, a scorching, cleansing wave against the chilling, clammy terror of the last 2 days. The fire would destroy the body of the car, making it useless to the family, but the serial numbers stamped deep into the cast-iron engine block would still be distinguishable for the authorities, serving as the final, unburial-able piece of evidence. He ran desperately for the dry creek bed, the intense heat of the fire on his back, the smoke already rising as a black, accusing column against the pale, lightening sky. He found Eleanor waiting exactly where he'd instructed, the engine of her car idling roughly, her headlights pointed toward the barely discernible road. He scrambled into the passenger seat, gasping for breath, clutching his shoulder. "Go! Drive fast!" Eleanor slammed the touring car into gear with a desperate grind. As they sped away, throwing up clouds of dust, the towering, imposing figure of Silas stumbled out of the burning gas station. He was limping heavily, a crude, blood-soaked bandage tied around his severely damaged leg, but he was undeniably alive. His face, illuminated by the unholy glow of the flames, was a mask of furious absolute defeat and agonizing pain. Behind him, the groves stop. The epicenter of their macabre enterprise and the source of so much terror was entirely engulfed in roaring flames, a self-immolating monument to human depravity. They drove relentlessly for hours, the punishing sun finally rising over the desolate, unending landscape. It was high noon when they finally reached the distant outskirts of a small, seemingly peaceful town, a place called Cedar Springs. and found the local sheriff's office, a tiny, single-room building that represented the long arm of the law. Elias, utterly exhausted, filthy and wounded, stumbled in with Eleanor, the tattered, blood-stained pages of the ledger clutched tightly in his functional hand. The sheriff, a weary, skeptical man named Holt, listened to their wild, horrific tale of murder, sabotage, and rendering with open disbelief. A family running a murder factory, rendering their victims for profit and scrap? Sheriff Holt scoffed, pushing his hat back on his head. Thorne, that sounds like something cooked up in a dime novel, a fever dream. Elias, his voice raspy and final, slammed the stained pages onto the sheriff's wooden desk. This is not a dream, Sheriff. This is the ledger. Read the entries, read the names. My car, a Model K, is burning to the ground right now at the Groves, but the engine block is there with the serial number. That is the proof you need. And if you go back now, you will find Silas and Martha, alive or dead, and the body of the man they had brutally imprisoned in the cellar. The overwhelming detail, the brutal realism, the meticulous, cold-blooded financial records, and the reference to traceable evidence, it finally broke through the sheriff's hardened skepticism. He recognized one of the names from a missing persons report filed months prior, and his face drained of all color. Within the week, a detachment of deputies was dispatched to the remains of the Groves. They found the ruins of the fire, the engine block, and the horrific discovery of the burial sites precisely marked on Elias's crude sketch. Silas and Martha were found, severely injured and burned, but alive, dragged from the inferno by the desperate, newly freed John, the man they had imprisoned and forgotten. Caleb was found dead, killed by John in the kitchen struggle, his silent life ending in a violent, righteous act of revenge. The family who turned their gas station into a trap for travelers was apprehended and faced swift, grim justice. They confessed, detailing their chilling, completely non-supernatural methodology, the sabotaged cars, the use of carbon monoxide for quiet dispatch, the gruesome rendering for material and profit, all driven by the harsh economic reality of isolation and the simple, terrible human lust for survival and money. Elias Thorne, his psychological terror finally receding into a deep, permanent scar, returned home a fundamentally changed man. He no longer sold drilling equipment. The terror had given him a purpose. He used the rest of his savings to travel, testifying truthfully and effectively in the trials, ensuring the full, grim truth of the Groves was known throughout the territory. He and Eleanor, who had faced and overcome their terror together, remained lifelong friends, bound by a terrible, shared secret. The Groves stop was permanently razed to the ground, the earth salted and marked as a permanent, desolate memorial to the anonymity and vulnerability of the early American traveler. The macabre end was not just for the victims, but for the predatory family whose greed, isolation, and monstrous humanity had twisted them into the very definition of evil. The story of the Groves became a chilling testament to the fact that the most terrifying evils are not spectral or magical, but purely horrifyingly human.